If you're a college or university student and you've developed technology perhaps in a class or outside of class and not with a faculty member, should you even form a company for the technology that you've developed? You'll want to talk to mentors, advisors, faculty members, and even organizations on campus that work with student startups to determine whether your technology is viable and whether you should commercialize the technology. You'll also want to determine whether you have the team to develop the technology and to operate a company. If you're technical founders, do you have business members of the team who could advise on business issues? Or if you're a business student, do you have technical founders who can work on technical issues? You'll also want to determine whether you're actually able to spend the time to work on the company. It takes a lot of time to develop a technology and work on a company, and do you have the amount of time and energy that it takes to fully develop the company? Also, do you understand your market? Do you know who the customers are, and are these customers looking for the technology that you've developed? These are just a few questions you want to answer in addition to other questions depending on your particular situation. When you determine your company is viable and you're ready to move forward and start working on the company, if you're considering getting an internship or another job, what are things that you want to consider before you take on this internship or job? There are 5 different things that you should consider when you are taking on an internship or a job and you haven't set up your company. First, you want to look at any internship documents or employment documents that the company has given you to determine what those documents say about the ownership of the intellectual property that you are interested in developing. The typical documents that you will look at are an employee offer letter or an internship offer letter, as well as a confidential information and inventions assignment agreement, and there may be other documents involved as well. Second, you want to make sure that you talk to the company to let them know that you have developed your own technology, and you want to make sure that you get an exception for the intellectual property that you're developing outside of the IP of the company that you'll be working with. In addition, when you leave the company, you want to make sure that you leave any confidential information that the company has given you with the company. Make sure you give everything back, including any documents you have on your computer or anything else that belongs to the company. You want to also make sure that you stay on good terms with the company. Although working on an internship or a summer job as a student, you'll likely have a shorter time period that you've developed a relationship with the company, but you still want to make sure that you're on good terms so that at some point in the future, the company doesn't come back and claim that the IP that you've created for your own company actually belongs to the company that you worked with. Finally, you'll want to make sure that you talk to an attorney if you have any questions about the employment documents that the company had you sign, to make sure that you carve out the technology that you're developing outside of the work that you're doing with the company, and you can be sure that you can use the technology that you've developed on your own for your own company without any claims from your employer or the internship that you're working with. When you're at the point that you've determined that the technology is viable and you're ready to move forward with the company, when should you actually form it? Well, there are a number of circumstances that would prompt when you should form the company. One, if you have more than one founder who you're developing the technology with, then you should form a company, and you should make sure that you clearly spell out the equity ownership interest of each of the founders in the company. This is important to get cleared up really early on so that there's no misunderstandings about who owns what percentage ownership interest in the company. You'll also want to form a company when you're developing IP, and if you're developing a technology company, you will. This is particularly important if you have more than one founder who's developing the technology. This is because if you have one of the founders who's developing the technology who leaves, and you haven't formed the company, then there could be concerns about the ownership of the IP and the ability for a later formed company to use the intellectual property of the departing founder. The third circumstance when you would want to form a company is when you are looking for financing. As a technology company, you'll likely be going after venture capital financing. And a VC is going to want to see the company formed as a Delaware corporation. The fourth reason when you would want to form a company is when you are hiring workers. If you need to bring on employees or independent contractors, you want the company itself to actually hire those individuals, as opposed to the founders individually to hire them. Also, if you have an independent contractor who's developing IP, if you form the entity, then you can have that intellectual property developed by that contractor be assigned to the business entity. A fifth reason to set up a business entity is when you are issuing options. So if you have an employee or an independent contractor and you'd like to partially compensate them with stock options, you'll actually have to set up a corporation in order to create a separate option pool and issue stock options. Whenever you are working on any aspect of the company, there's potential liability issues. And you should set up the company before operating if the liability issues are large, because most business entities, including the limited liability company and the corporation, are limited liability entities, which means subject to certain exceptions. If there are any debts and obligations of the company, those would solely be the responsibility of the company and not the individual founders. The seventh circumstance when you would want to form a company is when you're obtaining visas. If you're not a United States citizen or you're not a resident alien and you're interested in working on your startup, it's important that you talk to an immigration attorney to determine the way to legally work on your startup. It can be the case where setting up a corporation and capitalizing it with a certain amount of money would be the way you'd be able to legally obtain a visa. You'll also want to form the company pretty early on after the development of the technology to ensure that your price that you're paying for the stock in the company is relatively low. That way, when an investor comes and invests money into the company, they're going to pay a higher price for the stock in the company, and you can verify that the lower price that you've paid as a founder is reasonable because you've established the company at a stage that's a number of months or a year or so before you get financing from a third-party investor. And finally, when you sell stock in your company, that's a taxable event. If you're a technology company and you anticipate selling your stock through a merger, then you want to make sure you set up the company as soon as possible so you'll get the most favorable tax rates. If you hold on to your stock for more than a year, then the tax rate that you'll be subject to when you actually sell that stock will be long-term capital gains tax rates, as opposed to short-term capital gains tax rates, which are the same as ordinary income tax rates, and they're higher. The tax benefits begin to accrue as soon as you set up the company and you hold the stock in the company for more than a year.